We now come to poet Henry Derozio, and Derozio is a very important person to think about in terms of Indian English poetry itself, because Derozio's famous assertions, which goes like this: why is it that literature does not flourish in this country? Is the soil or the climate uncongenial to the culture of so delicate a flower, or is there a paucity of those talents which are necessary to accelerate its growth? There is something that withers in it in spite of every effort and every care. What is it? I have never yet satisfactorily ascertained. So, what Derozio is complaining is that there is no literature with capital L in that sense. So, he is talking about the absence of literature with capital L. There is a lack of national literature, as we can think about that, and then Derozio is unhappy, and he blames that probably there's something wrong with this country itself, because we don't have a national literature as such here. And so one can see Derozio's dissatisfaction arousing out of his comparison probably with his English counterparts. And then Derozio is born out of Luso-Indian marriage. He is very well versed in his counterparts, the romantic the romantic figures of first half of 19th century. He is complaining based on that comparison, that unlike the British romantic literature, which is talking about national figures, which is talking about the national culture. If you read any of Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats itself, there is a sense of the English that is emerging. And Derozio thinks that probably in India there is a lack of it, and he says, and that's why he uses the example of an agricultural example of a flower, that why doesn't any the climate or the soil does not even let a delicate flower grow, that there are no talents there which are finding a suitable ground to grow. He is unhappy with the situation of literature, specifically I think English literature in India, that Indians have not taken to probably growth of literature, as he keeps harping on the capital L literature, national literature in English. So therefore he takes the mantle onto his own hands, that I will write it. So he situates himself as the progenitor of a new tradition, and therefore he says, I am not satisfied by just becoming a witness. I will now publish from my own scrapbook. So there is a humility that you get to see, but also at the same time you get to see that uh, he is the initiator of a certain kind of experiment that will go on to very much initiate Indians into the literary path itself, right? And Derozio was a charismatic teacher who had wonderful students like Michael Dutt and others who followed his word. And what he publishes are pretty much can be said mimicking the romantic poets, most importantly mimicking Lord Byron. He has a poem called Don Juanix. So in this he mimics Don Juan, obviously. Makarand Paranjpe identifies Derozio with systematic and structural hybridization. he goes on to observe that it's not possible to explain, to understand, or understand a poet like Derozio merely by speaking of influence and imitation. In fact, whatever he borrowed, he superimposed in his local Indian material, creating a new idiom of English poetry. And thereby, we need to pay attention to figures like Derozio, because as Paranjpe rightly points out, that he is fashioning a new idiom itself. Thereby, what he's complaining, that he's not satisfied, and he will just tear out of his scrapbook things that he has written, and he will try to publish, so that it kind of spurs other people to write, and then his own poems itself, and it's very deeply invested in the Indian material itself. I obviously have a poem here which we'll discuss, but other poems like we see of his, he's mostly known for his volume called The Fakir of Jangira, a collection of poems which was published in 1828. In Jangira, Fakir of Jangira, Derozio tells us of a story of Nalini, a widow who is preparing to sacrifice herself on the funeral pyre of her husband itself. Again, very importantly, that what Derozio is doing here fits in with within the colonial construction of India. One of the preoccupation of the colonizers about India was the ritual of sati itself, right? And Derozio situates his poem within that cultural context, very aware of what the cultural connotations of it will be. Rajeshwari Sundarajan writes that Derozio is constructing a romantic tale, and it is the formal thrust of the genre that determines its message rather than the social critique of women's oppression. And so other scholars have also commented that the Fakir of Jangira has a very uneasy relationship with its social commentary and romance. So it situates itself within those two traditions itself, because on the one hand there is the reformist impulse of the colonial administration. We see that with Bentinck and others, the missionaries itself, who use sati to critique Hinduism and its practices. And then we, on the other hand, colonial constructions also think of sati as the Indian women's devotion, and admire their magnanimity in that way. But what Derozio does is to stay away from those kinds of ideas itself. What he does, he obviously partakes of them, but he does not go entirely to think of it as a magnanimous or act of devotion. What he does is that he is hesitant, and he is not hesitant to condemn this romanticization, that please don't romanticize sati. Yet also we can see that in the Fakir itself, he is trying to rethink the possibility of this oriental tale, and then trying to rework some of the romantic traditions itself of poetry in that way. He distinguishes himself by aesthetically reworking some of the Orientalist strategies of representation. If anyone reads Fakir of Jangiri, they will see that the way that contemporary accounts of forest, for example, worked, and the way that Derozio used them are very different, right? And for that we just need to see a short example, and that's why I have this poem is actually generally not talked about in terms of Derozio, but you can see the incorporation of local, right? The way that we had seen in William Jones itself, we had Kamdev, right? Sonnet to Rajni Gandha, the way that the pronunciation is, and you can see a typical romantic poem where the descriptions are so empirical, right? The fragrance comes upon my heart as it were a love breathed sigh from bashful maiden fair, so sweet, so soft. My inmost ruptured sense of bounteous nature feels the omnipotence. Thou art goodness by the cold world's eye unseen, unfelt, while breezes passed thee by, receiving a rich boon from thy sweet breast, an odor like breath of angels blessed. Thus the petitioners they wake the sigh of incense pure from gentle charity, that from her home in shades unseen, unknown, bestows her bounties. Blessed by those alone who feel their influence, the world never knows where and for whom that flower of sweetness blows. So one can see a typical romantic celebration of nature of a flower from India, and you can see the mixture of Indian and Western themes. The poem is written in a very Western, a romantic idiom itself. But you have Rajnigandha, who is talked about as a love breathed sigh from a bashful maiden fair, so sweet, so soft. Bounteous nature feels the omnipotence. Thou art like goodness by the cold world's eye unseen, unfelt. While breezes pass thee by, receiving a rich boon from thy sweet breast, an odor like the breath of angels blessed. So you have examples and metaphors that are Western in that way, but we are talking about a Indian flower itself. And you can see it's a sonnet, so obviously the rhyme scheme is also there to be seen. You can do the rhyme scheme. That might be a homework that you can think about, and think about whether it's an English sonnet or a Petrarchan variety itself, right? So you can do the rhyme scheme here, and you can see which variant does it fit into, and that will give us further clues to understanding Derozio as fashioning a new idiom, as we were talking about, right? So in that sense, Derozio brings India or Indian poetry in that sense in conversation with international discourses. What I mean by this is, it's if one were to think of, let's say, romanticism itself, we tend to think of romanticism mostly in terms of the British Isles when we read in English canon itself. If you now extend it to think about global romanticism, one example of that will be Derozio, an Indian poet who was borrowing from the romantic tradition itself and trying to fashion the romantic idiom here in India. And as you will remember, many of the early Indian poets in 19th century in vernaculars, in the regional Bhasha languages, Bhasha literatures itself, you will see many of them writing poetry after the romantic poets. Wordsworth was heavily popular in India. The romantic poets were very popular in India, not the romantic novelist, as we have seen, right? So what you see, therefore, is romanticism in the colony in that way, or romanticism as a global phenomena? Because if you expand the term, expand its territory, you can see romanticism also in America, right? So one can see across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, the kind of twists and turns and the kind of influences that this kind of poetry has had, and the idiom that is being fashioned, new idiom that is being fashioned in India. So therefore, Derozio becomes very important. What is striking also is that it shows a very individual mind of Derozio, that while following the Romantic tradition, shows that he is uh, unashamed to talk about these local vernacular phenomena, right? That he could have easily written about the British Isles and thinking about the Romantic tradition there, and like following like Lord Byron, Shelley, or Wordsworth, Keats, anyone, right? But he is unashamedly talking about the local phenomena, and he is talking about a local flower. Remember, the metaphor that he gives us in the beginning, as I talked about, is of a flower itself, right? That he talks about how nothing grows in India, right? That literary tradition has not been able to find a footing here, a flower which has not bloomed. But here, he takes the onus on his hand and he shows how a flower has bloomed here. A flower has bloomed in the Romantic tradition of poetry, right? So, in that way, rightly as Paranjpe says, Derozio is able to fashion a new idiom. Uh, our next poet in this exploration would be the Dutt sisters, especially Toru Dutt, as we have as we think of this international uh, perspective and reach of Indian English poetry. And this is just, we are looking at the like the early stages of Indian English poetry itself. And Toru Dutt herself was a phenomenal poet, considering she lived only 21 years, and then much of her work was published posthumously. But she had already gained a preeminence as an international writer very early in her life. Thus, she can be thought of as a groundbreaking writer, because she's already written and translated. She is not only a poet, she is also a translator who's translating Indian tales into English. And then we see both the international spectrum on the one hand, and on the other hand we see the incorporation of Indian tales, Indian myths, as we have seen already, right, from William Jones onwards through Derozio to Toru Dutt. And then you see that's gradually strengthening Indian English poetry. A bit of a background about Toru Dutt is that she spent her time in Bengal. She was born in West Bengal, and around the age of 13, she moves to Europe, living in France and England, but also traveling to Germany. So thereby she lives there for some part of her life. I think around after some time, uh, in around the age of 17, she comes back to India to stay here. Uh, the Dutts also converted to Christianity, and it irreversibly altered Toru and her elder sister Aru's relationship to the cultural surroundings. they therefore probably enjoyed, and there are certain kind of references that Toru makes about the Indian society, that once she comes back, she misses Europe a lot because of the restrictions and the gendered ways of behavior that are around in India. She makes a comment that like no one asks about other things, and the only question they seem to be preoccupied about is whether I have gotten married or not. And that's where settled in Nice in France, and they studied French. And in the spring of 1870s, they traveled to England, where they lived in London and then in Cambridge and St. Leonard's. As the first women to attend Cambridge's higher lectures for women, Toru and Aru participated in a revolutionary movement for British women's education, meeting with Anne Jemima Clow, the first principal of Newnham College, and other intellectual English women. Uh, uh, Following Aru's death from tuberculosis, the Dutt family settles back into life in Calcutta. For the rest of Toru's life, her letters would report plans for travel and relocation to France or England. Uh, Toru very early started exploring how turns to French might serve both as sources of inspiration and resources for potentially freeing acts of literary dislocation. Uh, a sheaf gleaned in French fields, which Govind Chandra Dutt first helped to see into print in 1876, remains a groundbreaking work, acutely attentive to the technical challenges of conveying metrical effects across linguistic boundary. Both Toru and Aru Dutt's translations combine focused analytical thinking with sort of creative improvisation itself. The most important work that comes out of Toru and Aru would be the ancient ballads, and legends of Hindustan, that appears in 1882. And we witness is that there is actually an introduction by Edmund Goss, and this, as you can see, is published posthumously. Uh, it it has retellings of the Mahabharatas, the Ramayanas, the Bengali oral tradition, the Vishnu Purana, and each poem uh, reconsiders and retells these very well-known tales in English itself. The oral tradition is translated. Translation and transformation, both of them occur in these poems itself. So what we get to see is a poet who is thinking about her own world through her own cosmopolitan upbringing. Someone who's not comfortable with her own surroundings. As I said, that like they uneasily try to fit into the cultural life. She wanted to stay abroad, obviously, because of her familiarity and also her radical exposure towards very progressive movements and the restrictions back home that she had faced. But notwithstanding that, they kept, and the Dutt family is a huge literary family itself. Many of them go on to become leading figures in Bangla and English cultural and literary spheres. But Toru's substantial work draws and brings together these international as well as native traditions. She is not afraid, like what Derozio inaugurates, she is not afraid to bring to light the local, even when she could have probably easily written poems in English without any references to India or the Bengali traditions itself. But what she does is to bring these works to a new light, bring them in a very different language itself, to a very different audience altogether. And these works are almost, as you can, if you see, are happening much before 20th century itself. It's the late 19th century, and they are writing at a time when nationalist fervors are almost simmering. They are not, though, writing out of nationalist concerns yet, but you can see a very strong emphasis on bringing India and representing India, thereby taking control of their own land, representation over their land, wresting it from the white people. So, if you look at the three poets we have we have looked at before, all of them try to attempt to talk about, represent India in various different ways. And in Toru, Dutt, we'll look at a very different way of representing India. She talks about, and then as we are talking about the ancient ballads and legends of Hindustan, one of the poems that we'll look at will be Sita, where she looks at the mythical figure of Sita, who's and she is not only content with retelling the myth, she will talk about the idea of loss, idea of memory, nostalgia, and then also slip in her own life's observations regarding gender equations. And that's what makes her such a remarkable figure in terms of Indian English poetry, because one gets to see that at such a young age and in the nascent stages of Indian English writing, we see such confident assertions about Indian local themes in English itself.